All right, welcome back for the Unit 2 notes, Living World Biodiversity. This is the final video, Part 5. Specifically in Part 5, we are going to talk about ecological succession, something that we did kind of talk about when we went on our nature trek out by Galena. We talked about the recovery of that, some of the species that existed after the fire. So, ecological succession is something that happens over a long period of time. It's very gradual, where species begin to change and come back to an area or are introduced to an area. There are two types, primary succession and secondary succession. Biggest way to remember this, primary succession occurs in an area that had nothing. There was no species there. Typically the soil didn't have any nutrients to it. It was very poor soil, as opposed to secondary succession, which is something that happens after an area is disturbed by an environmental disturbance. So primary ecological succession is one example where you have exposed rocks. So you can imagine that a glacier may have caused this. So there's no life at all, and there's barely any soil. And so you can see the soil level here as we go through time, and we start to get more and more nutritious soil. But as we go through time, you're going to start with just exposed rocks. Then you're going to get lichens and mosses. You're going to notice that there's just going to be a little bit of life, and it has a very low primary productivity. Then we'll start to get small herbs and shrubs as this beginning level begins to die, decompose, and bacteria begins to make the soil more fertile. Over time, you will start to get more and more complex and tall species. And this is how a forest would be formed from, say, maybe a grassland. Now, what's important to understand here is that this is not always going to happen in this exact perfect way. This is just an example of one specific community that is being grown from nothing. Secondary ecological succession is also considered to be restoration. So you can imagine that after a mass fire, you will start to get the annual weeds that will come back because they have a fairly high tolerance. And then you'll get perennial weeds and grasses. This is actually kind of where the Galena, the big mountain or hill behind Galena is at right now, where there are certain perennial weeds and grasses growing, but we don't have anything majorly complex. Whereas after a while, there will be enough time where shrubs and small pine seedlings occur, and then maybe that mature oak and hickory forest and an old growth forest may be able to rise again. So we can imagine that given enough time after a major disaster, an ecosystem can rebuild itself. Now, this might not be the same species or ecosystem that it was before the fire, because there's no guarantee that those species didn't go extinct. These are just going to be new species that are able to be introduced to this area. Now, like I said, there's no predictable way. This isn't something that we just know is happening. The traditional view was that there was a balance in nature, and there were climax communities, and there was a point where it stopped. Nowadays, we kind of look at it as just an ever-changing mosaic where you get many different changes occurring on a different scale. There's no specific rhyme or reason to it other than following natural selection and adaptations. And so you're not guaranteed that primary succession or secondary succession are going to follow these particular examples. So it's important to understand that just because these are nice examples and it explains the process, it doesn't mean that this is always going to be what happens. When we talk about the succession occurring, so this is another example of primary succession down here. A pioneer species is that species that comes in early, usually unoccupied habitat, and comes in over time and adapts to its particular conditions. So this might result in a new species being found, but these are like your lichens, your mosses, grass, or a mix. These species are the first to enter. They have very little competition, so they are able to thrive. And that is the end of Part 5. That's actually the end of all of Unit 2 notes, the Unit 2 lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to bring them to class. We will, of course, be going over many of these concepts in class through some activities and labs. So always ask questions when you are unsure.